Ah, mes amis, tonight we enter the glittering Bramblewick Ballroom, where elegance rules, smiles deceive, and every step follows a rhythm. A man dances his final waltz beneath crystal chandeliers, surrounded by witnesses who saw everything, yet understood nothing. Listen carefully, for in this mystery, even the music lies. Chapter 1. The Waltz That Never Ended. The Bramblewick Ballroom had been designed to impress and to endure. Its high-arched ceiling caught the glow of a dozen crystal chandeliers, each one scattering light like shards of gold across the polished floor. Tall mirrors lined the walls, multiplying movement and laughter until it seemed as though the room contained twice as many dancers as it truly did. Silk gowns whispered, patterned shoes glided. The orchestra, elevated slightly at the far end, played with measured elegance, each note falling exactly where it should. It was a room that thrived on precision, and on this night precision would become deadly. The waltz had begun at exactly 9:15. Couples took their places in smooth, practiced motions, hands meeting, backs straightening, faces settling into expressions of cultivated delight. Society gathered here often, politicians, patrons of the arts, widows with fortunes intact, men whose reputations were as polished as the floor beneath their feet. Among them moved Mr. Edmund Caldwell. He was not the most striking man in the room, but he was certainly one of the most observed. Well-dressed, well-funded, and well-known, Caldwell carried himself with the assurance of someone who had learned long ago that rooms like this existed to welcome men like him. He smiled as he stepped onto the floor, his hand resting lightly on his partner's back. The music swelled. The dance began. From the edge of the ballroom, Hercule Poirot watched. He did not dance. He never did. He preferred instead to observe the rhythm of people, not music. He stood near one of the mirrored walls, hands folded neatly, eyes alert beneath his immaculate brow. "A waltz," he murmured softly to himself, "is a most revealing thing." Poirot's gaze moved across the floor, noting how some couples flowed effortlessly while others merely followed the pattern, counting steps in their heads. He saw tension where smiles suggested ease. He saw calculation beneath courtesy. And he saw Mr. Caldwell. The man danced well, better than expected. His movements were controlled, elegant, his timing impeccable. Yet Poirot noticed something else, a faint stiffness in the shoulders, a momentary hesitation at the end of each turn. Not fear, anticipation. The orchestra reached a gentle crescendo. The couples rotated in wide arcs, skirts flaring, shoes brushing the floor in perfect time. Then, mid-turn, Caldwell faltered. It was subtle at first, a slight misplacement of the foot, a hand tightening where it should have guided. His partner glanced up at him, concern flickering across her face. "Are you all right?" she whispered. Caldwell tried to answer. He did not finish the step. His knees buckled, his hands slipping from her back as he collapsed onto the floor, the music continuing for a stunned heartbeat before dissolving into chaos. A scream rose. The waltz ended. For several seconds, no one moved. The chandeliers continued to glow. The orchestra fell silent, bows hovering in midair. Dancers stood frozen in their positions, staring down at the man who lay motionless on the floor between them. Poirot moved immediately. He knelt beside Caldwell, careful not to disturb anything, his trained eye taking in every detail, the pallor of the skin, the unnatural stillness, the glassy stare fixed on nothing. Poirot did not touch him. He did not need to. "This man," Poirot said quietly, "is dead." The word rippled through the ballroom like a chill. A doctor was summoned, though Poirot already knew what the verdict would be. When the physician arrived and confirmed it moments later, the reaction was immediate and predictable. Shock, disbelief, murmured speculation. How could this happen? He was perfectly fine a moment ago. Did he trip? Poirot listened and remembered. The guests were ushered to the edges of the room as the authorities were called. The orchestra packed their instruments in silence. Caldwell's partner sat trembling in a chair, staring at her hands as if they no longer belonged to her. Poirot stood back now, allowing the scene to breathe. No blood, no visible injury, no overturned furniture. A death as elegant as the dance itself. "Poison," Poirot murmured. He said it softly, to no one in particular. Deaths that arrived without violence often did. Inspector Harold Finch arrived shortly thereafter, a solid, practical man whose patience had been worn thin by too many society scandals and too few straightforward answers. "Monsieur Poirot," Finch said with a nod of recognition. "I should have known you'd be here." Poirot inclined his head politely. "I was invited for the music." Finch glanced at the body. "And stayed for the murder." Poirot allowed himself the smallest smile. Finch crouched beside Caldwell, examining him with professional detachment. No wounds, no sign of a fall, he just stopped. Poirot nodded. "In perfect time." Finch frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot gestured gently toward the orchestra. "The collapse occurred on the third beat of the measure, the same beat each time the dancers turned." Finch blinked. "You noticed that?" Poirot's moustache twitched. "I notice many things." The ballroom was sealed. Guests were asked to remain, politely, firmly, until statements could be taken. Unease spread quickly. Conversations lowered to whispers. Eyes darted from face to face, wondering who might have been closer than they appeared. Poirot walked the perimeter of the dance floor. He examined the polished boards carefully. No spills, no broken glass, no discarded object. Nothing that should have caused a man to collapse mid-step. Poirot turned his attention to the music stand near the orchestra. Sheets of music lay open, untouched. "Did anything unusual happen during the performance?" Poirot asked the conductor. The man shook his head nervously. "No, monsieur. We played as rehearsed." Poirot nodded. "And the tempo?" "Exactly as written." Poirot smiled faintly. Rehearsed, written, planned. Words that often appeared again in murder. Poirot returned to where Caldwell had fallen. He crouched once more, not to examine the body, but the space around it. Who had been closest? Who had brushed past? Who had shared breath, space, or touch? Poirot's gaze lifted to the mirrored walls. In those reflections he saw not one ballroom but many. Each angle captured a different truth, a different arrangement of proximity. Poirot straightened. "A waltz," he said softly, "is not chaos, it is structure." Inspector Finch joined him. "You're thinking this wasn't spontaneous." Poirot met his eyes. "On the contrary, Inspector, I am thinking it was choreographed." Finch's expression darkened. "You're saying someone planned his death to coincide with the dance," Poirot nodded, "and trusted the movement, the crowd, and the music to hide the act." Finch exhaled slowly. "That's bold." Poirot smiled faintly. "So is murder in a ballroom." As the night wore on, the chandeliers dimmed slightly, casting longer shadows across the emptying floor. Caldwell's body was removed with quiet efficiency, the space where he fell already beginning to look deceptively ordinary again. Poirot remained. He always did. He looked up at the glittering ceiling, at the mirrors, at the floor where footsteps would soon return. "The dance," Poirot murmured, "will continue." He adjusted his moustache, eyes thoughtful. "But the rhythm," he added softly, "has already been broken." And somewhere within the elegance of Bramblewick Ballroom, the first mistake of the killer waited patiently to be noticed. Chapter 2. A collapse in perfect time. A collapse that occurred in perfect time was never an accident. Hercule Poirot understood this as the Bramblewick Ballroom settled into an uneasy stillness. The chandeliers continued to glow, but their light now felt accusatory, as though it illuminated not elegance but error. The polished floor, so recently alive with movement, had become a map of stillness, each dancer frozen where the music had abandoned them. Inspector Harold Finch stood near the center of the floor, hands on his hips, staring down at the space where Edmund Caldwell had fallen. "People collapse all the time," Finch muttered. "Heart, stroke, weakness." Poirot shook his head gently. "Yes, Inspector, but they do not collapse on cue." Finch looked up. "You're still thinking the timing matters." Poirot smiled faintly. "I am thinking it is everything." The orchestra remained seated, instruments resting awkwardly in their laps. Poirot approached the conductor, a thin man with trembling fingers and a practiced expression of composure. Monsieur, Poirot said kindly, you will forgive a small curiosity. The conductor nodded eagerly. Of course, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot gestured toward the sheet music. The waltz you played, was it altered in any way this evening? The conductor frowned. No, it is a standard Viennese piece. We've performed it dozens of times. Poirot leaned closer. And the tempo? Consistent, the conductor replied, exactly as rehearsed. Poirot nodded, satisfied. You see, Inspector, Poirot said as he turned back, consistency creates predictability. Finch frowned. And predictability creates opportunity. Poirot inclined his head. Precisely. Poirot next turned his attention to the dancers who had been closest to Caldwell when he fell. They stood together now, a small cluster of discomfort and whispered reassurance. Caldwell's partner, Miss Lillian Harper, sat nearby, pale and shaken. Poirot approached her slowly, his voice gentle. Mademoiselle, he said, may I ask you something? She nodded weakly. When did you first notice something was wrong? She swallowed. Just before he fell, he hesitated, just for a moment. I thought he'd lost the step. Poirot nodded. And did he say anything? No, she said quickly. He just tightened his grip. Poirot's eyes sharpened, as if steadying himself. She hesitated. Yes. Poirot smiled faintly. Merci. Poirot straightened and looked around the floor again. Hesitation, tightened grip, no cry. These were not the signs of surprise. They were the signs of expectation. Inspector Finch followed Poirot to the edge of the ballroom. You think he knew it was coming? Finch said quietly. Poirot nodded. Not consciously, but his body did. Finch frowned. Poison again. Poirot smiled. Poison is the only murderer patient enough to wait for music. Poirot requested the guests' drinks be collected. There were glasses everywhere, on small tables, on trays near the walls, in the hands of servers frozen mid-duty when the music stopped. Finch raised an eyebrow. You think it was in the drink? Poirot shook his head gently. Not all drinks. He picked up one glass from a nearby table and held it to the light. In a ballroom, Poirot said. Softly, people touch many things, but they trust only what is offered at the right moment. Finch's expression darkened. During the dance, Poirot nodded, when hands are occupied, when attention is elsewhere, when movement disguises exchange. Poirot placed the glass down carefully. The dance, he said, was not merely decoration. A staff member approached nervously. Inspector, there's something else. Finch turned. What is it? One of the footmen says Mr. Caldwell refused champagne earlier in the evening, said he felt unwell. Poirot's eyes lit up. Ah, he murmured, a man preparing for something. Finch frowned. Or already poisoned. Poirot shook his head. No, a man who knew he must be precise tonight. Poirot paced slowly, counting steps across the floor. 1, 2, 3, turn. He stopped exactly where Caldwell had collapsed. Poirot turned back to Finch. Inspector, he said softly, tell me, what happens to a man who is poisoned too early? Finch shrugged. He collapses early. Poirot nodded. And that would attract attention. Poirot smiled faintly. But a man who collapses in time becomes invisible. Poirot requested the ballroom be cleared, except for those present at the exact moment of the collapse. Finch complied reluctantly. As the doors closed, the air grew heavier. Poirot addressed the group calmly. You all saw a man die, he said, and yet none of you saw a crime. Faces shifted. Some looked offended. Others looked afraid. That, Poirot continued, is because the crime was hidden inside something familiar. Poirot gestured toward the orchestra. Music, he said, toward the dancers. Movement, toward the chandeliers. Elegance. Poirot folded his hands. And elegance, he finished, is a very effective disguise. Poirot returned to the mirrored wall and studied the reflections carefully. From certain angles, Caldwell's collapse had been partially obscured by turning couples. From others, his partner's body had blocked the view. The room itself had collaborated, unknowingly, politely. Poirot nodded to himself. The killer trusted the choreography, he murmured. Inspector Finch joined him. You're saying the dance hid the delivery, Poirot smiled. I am saying the dance was the delivery. Finch's eyes widened. How? Poirot turned slowly. That, he said, is the next steps. As the authorities prepared to escort the guests away for statements, Poirot remained behind once more. He walked to the exact spot where the music had stopped. He closed his eyes briefly. In his mind, the orchestra played again. The dancers moved, the crowd breathed as one, and in that movement, a single action, small, precise, invisible, had ended a life. Poirot opened his eyes. A collapse in perfect time, he said softly, requires rehearsal. He adjusted his mustache. And rehearsal, he added, always leaves traces. Chapter 3, Music that Covered the Truth. Music had always been trusted. It softened silences, filled awkward pauses, and guided bodies into harmony. At Bramblewick Ballroom, it did something far more dangerous. It covered the truth. The morning after Edmund Caldwell's death, the ballroom felt smaller. Without gowns and music, the vast space echoed with every footstep. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, revealing scuff marks on the floor and faint outlines where dancers had turned in perfect arcs the night before. Hercule Poirot walked slowly across the floor, counting steps under his breath. 1, 2, 3, turn. Inspector Finch watched him with narrowed eyes. You're mapping the dance. Poirot nodded. I am mapping the opportunity. Poirot stopped near the orchestra platform. Inspector, he said, tell me, how loud was the music at the moment of the collapse? Finch shrugged. Loud enough. A full waltz. Why? Poirot smiled faintly. Because loud music forgives many sins. Poirot stepped onto the platform and examined the musicians' arrangement. Chairs were placed close together, music stands angled carefully to avoid collisions during page turns. Nothing appeared disturbed. And yet, Poirot murmured, someone needed the music. He turned to the conductor. Monsieur, Poirot asked gently, do you recall anything unusual? The conductor hesitated. Only a request. Poirot's eyes sharpened. A request? Yes, before the waltz began, Mr. Caldwell himself asked that we repeat the final passage. Finch frowned. Repeat? The conductor nodded. He said it was his favorite section. Poirot smiled. Slowly, a repeat, he murmured, creates certainty. Poirot returned to the dance floor. He imagined it now, the orchestra swelling, couples rotating, the repeated passage approaching. Everyone relaxed. Nothing unexpected remained. Poirot turned to Finch. The killer needed one thing above all else. Finch crossed his arms. Timing. Poirot nodded. And music provides timing that people trust. The staff were questioned next. Footmen, servers, floor attendants. One name surfaced repeatedly, Julian Merritt, a junior attendant responsible for circulating refreshments during dances. He moved through the couples, one maid explained. That was his job. Poirot smiled faintly. Movement again. Merritt was brought in, a pale young man with nervous hands. I didn't do anything wrong, he said quickly. Poirot nodded kindly. I believe you, Merritt blinked. You do? Poirot leaned closer. But you did something important. Merritt swallowed. I handed Mr. Caldwell a cloth. Finch looked up sharply. What kind of cloth? A handkerchief, Merritt said. He looked flushed. He asked for it. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And where did you get this handkerchief? Poirot asked. Merritt hesitated. From the side table there provided for guests. Poirot nodded. Yes, but not all are identical. Poirot examined the side table. Most handkerchiefs were linen, clean, white, folded neatly. One was missing. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. A soaked cloth, he murmured. Pressed to the skin, absorbed quickly. No taste, no glass. Finch stared. You think the poison was on the handkerchief? Poirot nodded. Music covered the moment. Movement covered the exchange. Poirot turned to Merritt. Did you notice anything unusual about it? Merritt shook his head. Only that it smelled faintly of lavender. Poirot smiled sadly. Lavender. he said softly, is often used to hide sharper things. Poirot gathered the remaining guests later that day. He spoke calmly, deliberately. "Last night," Poirot said, "you trusted the music to guide you, and so did the killer." Poirot gestured toward the floor. "No glass was needed, no toast required, only a moment when sound overwhelmed thought." Poirot turned to a woman seated near the front. "You were closest to Mr. Caldwell," Poirot said gently. "What did you hear?" She frowned. "The music, nothing else." Poirot nodded. "Exactly." Poirot folded his hands. "The music did not kill him," he said, "but it made the killing invisible." Inspector Finch exhaled slowly. "So the poison was delivered during the dance?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, through something that appeared helpful, civilized, necessary." Finch's voice hardened. "Then the killer needed access to the attendants." Poirot smiled faintly. "Or influence over them." Poirot looked toward the balcony above the ballroom. "Music," he said softly, "does not only cover sound." He glanced upward. "It also draws the eye away from where it should be." As the investigation deepened, Poirot stood alone once more at the center of the floor. He imagined the chandeliers glowing again, the orchestra repeating the final passage, the handkerchief exchanged mid-turn, the collapse arriving on cue. Poirot adjusted his moustache. "Music," he murmured, "is the most polite accomplice." He turned toward the doors. "And politeness," he added softly, "is how murder is most often invited in." Chapter 4. The dancer who missed a step. A dancer who missed a step was not always careless. Sometimes that dancer was listening too closely. The Bramblewick Ballroom, stripped now of music and movement, revealed its imperfections in daylight. The polished floor bore faint scuffs where shoes had turned too sharply. The mirrors, once flattering, reflected everything with cruel honesty. Without the orchestra, the room felt exposed, like a stage after the curtain had fallen, when the illusion had nowhere left to hide. Hercule Poirot stood at the center of the floor, eyes half closed, replaying the night in his mind. The repeated passage of the waltz, the circulating attendants, the handkerchief, the collapse, precise, timed, inevitable. Something still disturbed him. Someone had missed a step. Inspector Finch approached, holding a thin folder. "Statements from the dancers who were closest to Caldwell. Most say the same thing." Poirot opened his eyes. "Most?" Finch nodded. "One doesn't." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, there is always one." But the dancer in question was Mr. Victor Langley, a tall, well-dressed man in his early 40s, known in society for his impeccable manners and his devotion to ballroom dancing. He had partnered several women that evening and had been positioned only 2 couples away from Caldwell at the moment of the collapse. Langley sat stiffly now, hands folded, posture perfect even in discomfort. "Monsieur Langley," Poirot said gently, "you dance very well." Langley blinked, surprised. "Thank you." Poirot tilted his head. "Well enough to notice when others do not." Langley frowned. "I don't understand." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "During the final passage of the waltz, you hesitated." Langley's eyes flickered. "Everyone did. When he fell." Poirot shook his head gently. "No, you hesitated before." Silence stretched. Langley swallowed. I thought I heard something." Poirot smiled faintly. "Music hides many sounds, monsieur, but not all." Langley explained carefully. "I heard a sharp intake of breath," he said. "Not from Caldwell, from someone else. A woman, I think. Right as we turned." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Pain?" Langley nodded. "Brief, suppressed." Poirot straightened. "Thank you," he said softly. "That is most helpful." Finch frowned as Langley was escorted out. "You think that matters?" Poirot replied calmly. "It matters because it confirms timing." Finch crossed his arms. "Timing of what?" Poirot gestured toward the dance floor. "The moment when assistance became necessity." Poirot requested the staff list again, this time not the attendants but the dance stewards, those responsible for guiding couples, correcting spacing, and intervening if collisions occurred. One name stood out: Mrs. Eleanor Brookhurst, a senior steward, elegant, trusted, constantly moving along the edge of the floor, close enough to intervene without drawing attention. Poirot asked to speak with her. She arrived composed, her graying hair neatly arranged, her expression one of calm professionalism. "You were close to Mr. Caldwell," Poirot said gently. She nodded. "Yes, that is my duty." Poirot smiled. "And your movements are precise." She inclined her head. "They must be." Poirot leaned closer. "Did you assist Mr. Caldwell during the dance?" Her eyes flickered, just once. "I adjusted spacing near him," she said. "Nothing unusual." Poirot nodded. "You touched him." Her lips tightened. Briefly, Poirot's voice was calm. "Where?" She hesitated. "His arm." Poirot smiled faintly. "Near the handkerchief." Silence fell like a held breath. Inspector Finch stepped in. "Mrs. Brookhurst, did you notice anything odd?" She stiffened. "Only that Mr. Caldwell seemed unwell." Poirot nodded. "Unwell enough to request help?" She shook her head. "He didn't speak." Poirot replied softly. "He didn't need to." Poirot gestured gently. "You are trained to read dancers' bodies. You saw his hesitation, his tightened grip, his missed step." Her composure cracked slightly. "I thought he would recover," she whispered. Poirot nodded. "And when he did not," she swallowed, "I stepped back." Poirot's eyes were kind but sharp. "You stepped back," he repeated, "because you knew your role was finished." Poirot now understood the layering. The poison had been delivered subtly through the handkerchief under cover of music. But when Caldwell's body reacted sooner than expected, the plan required adaptation. That adaptation had not been violent. It had been withholding. Poirot explained it quietly to Finch. He faltered. He needed support. Someone trained to intervene was close enough to help. Finch frowned. "But she didn't." Poirot nodded. "Because the plan required him to fall." Poirot returned to Mrs. Brookhurst. "You were not the planner," Poirot said gently. "You were the insurance." She closed her eyes. "They told me," she whispered, "that he would simply lose consciousness, that it would look natural." Poirot nodded. "And when he didn't?" Her voice broke. "I froze." Poirot leaned back. "A dancer who misses a step," he said softly, "is not always clumsy. Sometimes they are refusing to change the choreography." Finch's expression hardened. "Who told you?" She hesitated, then spoke. "Mr. Lionel Harcourt." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Harcourt?" Finch snapped. "The patron?" Poirot nodded slowly. "A man with influence," Poirot murmured. "Enough to guide music, staff, and movement." "Shut the web," tightened. Poirot addressed Finch quietly. "Harcourt arranged the orchestra's repeat. He influenced staff placement. He ensured the handkerchief reached the victim, and he placed trusted people near enough to observe, but not save." Finch exhaled sharply. "All hidden inside elegance." Poirot smiled faintly. "Elegance is simply discipline wearing silk." That evening, Poirot stood alone once more in the ballroom. He walked the pattern of the waltz, counting softly. 1, 2, 3. He stopped exactly where Caldwell had fallen. "A dancer missed a step," Poirot murmured. He looked up at the chandeliers. "And that," he added softly, "is where the truth slipped through." Poirot adjusted his moustache. "The killer relied on perfection," he said, "but perfection leaves no room for mercy." Chapter 5. Poison hidden in plain sight. Poison was most effective when it looked like nothing at all, not a vial, not a powder, not a dramatic gesture beneath candlelight. At Bramblewick Ballroom, poison had moved politely, invisibly, carried not by suspicion, but by custom. Hercule Poirot stood beside the long refreshment table where crystal glasses, linen cloths, and small silver trays were arranged with ceremonial neatness. In daylight, the table looked harmless, civilized, respectable, and therefore dangerous. Inspector Finch watched him closely. "You're certain the handkerchief was only the beginning?" Poirot nodded. "The handkerchief delivered the poison, yes, but it did not explain the certainty." Finch frowned. Certainty of what? Poirot lifted a single glass from the table and held it toward the light. Certainty that the poison would work, he said softly. Poirot asked that every object Caldwell might have touched be gathered. Glasses, cloths, gloves, dance cards, fans. They were laid out carefully on a long side table, each item tagged, catalogued, stripped of elegance, and reduced to evidence. Poirot moved slowly among them. He did not rush. Poison rewarded patience. "Inspector," Poirot said, "tell me, how long was Mr. Caldwell dancing before he collapsed?" Finch checked his notes. "Nearly 6 minutes." Poirot nodded. "Longer than a simple contact poison would require." Finch blinked. "So the handkerchief wasn't enough?" Poirot smiled faintly. "It began the process, but something else ensured the finish." Poirot returned to the orchestra platform. He examined the rail, the steps, the small side table where musicians kept water and personal items. A single glass stood apart, thicker than the rest, plain, utilitarian. "Who drinks from this?" Poirot asked. The conductor replied, "That is for guests who request water during the dance. We keep it here." Poirot nodded slowly. "During a waltz," he murmured, "a man grows warm. His breathing changes, his mouth dries." Finch's expression sharpened. "You think Caldwell drank water?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, after the handkerchief, before the collapse." Poirot examined the glass closely. Nothing unusual, and yet its placement bothered him. Too convenient. Poirot questioned Caldwell's partner again. Miss Harper was calmer now, grief settling into a stunned resignation. "He asked for water," she said softly, "just before the final passage." Poirot inclined his head. "And who brought it?" She hesitated. "One of the stewards. I'm not sure which." Poirot smiled gently. "You are sure enough." Miss Harper swallowed. "Mrs. Brookhurst." Poirot nodded. Everything aligned now. The handkerchief initiated the poison, subtle, controlled, odorless, enough to weaken, enough to confuse, but not enough to guarantee death in public view. That required something stronger, something swallowed. Poirot turned to Finch. "The poison was hidden," he said, "inside normality." Finch frowned. "Water?" Poirot nodded. "The most innocent drink in the room." Laboratory results confirmed Poirot's suspicion. 2 substances, 1 topical, 1 ingested. Individually, neither would have guaranteed death so quickly. Together, they danced perfectly. Finch stared at the report. "A compound effect," Poirot smiled faintly, "like partners in a waltz." Poirot requested that Mrs. Eleanor Brookhurst be brought in again. She arrived pale, her dignity thinning with every step. "You helped him," Poirot said gently. "You gave him water." She nodded weakly. "He looked unwell." Poirot leaned closer. "And you chose which glass?" Tears welled in her eyes. "They told me which one." Poirot nodded. "Mr. Harcourt," she whispered. "Yes. Santi." Mr. Lionel Harcourt was summoned that evening, a man of refinement, of wealth, of impeccable posture. He greeted Poirot with a smile that had convinced many rooms before this one. "Monsieur Poirot," Harcourt said lightly. "Tragic business." Poirot returned the smile. "Indeed," Poirot said, "especially when tragedy follows rehearsal." Harcourt laughed softly. "You accuse me of planning a man's death in front of 100 witnesses." Poirot nodded calmly. "Yes," Harcourt raised an eyebrow. "How inelegant." Poirot replied softly. "On the contrary, it was too elegant." Poirot stepped closer. "You knew the tempo," Poirot said. "You arranged the repeat," he continued. "You placed the steward," he added, "and you ensured the water was ready." Harcourt's smile thinned. Poirot finished quietly. "You hid poison where no one looks. Inside kindness." Harcourt leaned back. "Even if I did, you cannot prove I touched anything." Poirot smiled. "I do not need to," he said. Poirot gestured to the evidence. "You touched people," Poirot continued. "You directed them, and poison does not care who pours the glass." Only that it is poured. Silence followed. Then Harcourt spoke, voice low. Caldwell was going to expose everything. Poirot nodded. And you chose choreography over confrontation. Harcourt's eyes hardened. He deserved it. Poirot replied softly. Deserving is not your decision. Later that night, Poirot stood alone in the ballroom once more. The refreshment table had been cleared, the orchestra silent, the floor empty. He looked at the spot where a glass of water had changed everything. Poison hidden in plain sight, Poirot murmured. He adjusted his moustache. It succeeds, he added softly, because people trust what is familiar. Poirot turned toward the exit. And that, he said, is why it is so often invited in. Chapter 7. A witness out of rhythm. Every crime had a moment when the pattern faltered. Not enough to be noticed by everyone, but enough for someone whose instincts were sharper than their courage. At Bramblewick Ballroom, the waltz had flowed too smoothly, the collapse too perfectly timed. Yet one person had felt the rhythm break, like a musician hearing a wrong note buried inside a flawless performance. That person had not spoken, until now. The witness was Edith Marrow, second violinist in the Bramblewick Orchestra. She was not young, not timid, and not accustomed to attention. She had spent 3 decades in orchestras where precision mattered more than applause. Her life was measured in beats, bars, and pauses, and because of that she noticed what others dismissed. Poirot met her in the practice room adjoining the ballroom, a narrow space that smelled faintly of resin and old wood. Her violin lay across her knees like something alive and watchful. You wished to speak with me, she said carefully. Poirot inclined his head. I wished to listen. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then I will tell you what I heard. The final passage, Edith began, was not wrong, but it was pressured. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Pressured how? The conductor took it slightly faster, she said. Barely noticeable, but enough to tighten the dancers' turns. Inspector Finch frowned. Why would that matter? Edith looked at him coolly. Because when dancers move faster, they trust their partners more and think less. Poirot smiled faintly. And, Edith continued, someone signaled the repeat early. Finch stiffened. Signaled? She nodded. From the balcony, a subtle gesture, too subtle for most. Poirot leaned forward. But not for a musician? She shook her head slowly. No, we live by signals. Poirot asked her to describe the moment of collapse. She closed her eyes. I heard it, she said quietly. Not the fall, the breath. Poirot nodded. Before? Yes, she said. A sharp intake, then a pause where there should have been sound. Finch frowned. Music doesn't pause. Edith looked at him. Exactly. Poirot felt the final piece settle. The orchestra kept playing, Poirot murmured, but the body could not. Edith's voice trembled slightly now. I wanted to stop, she said. I wanted to drop my bow, but the conductor didn't, so we played on. Poirot nodded gently. Because stopping would have broken the illusion. Tears welled in her eyes. I knew something was wrong, I just didn't know what. Poirot spoke softly. That is enough, Bainford. Inspector Finch paced afterward, jaw tight. She heard the signal, she heard the breath. That's enough to place intent. Poirot nodded. And more importantly, it places control. Finch stopped. You mean Harcourt again? Poirot replied calmly. A man who conducts without touching the baton. Poirot requested access to the balcony. From above, the ballroom looked smaller, more manageable. Patterns were clearer. Dancers formed shapes. Attendants moved like pieces on a board. And from here, timing could be guided without ever stepping onto the floor. Poirot stood exactly where Edith said the signal had come from. He raised his hand slightly. From here, a conductor would see it, a steward would see it, a patron watching closely would see it, but no guest would. Poirot lowered his hand. Control, he murmured, without visibility. Harcourt was brought in again that evening. This time, Poirot did not accuse. He explained. You adjusted the tempo, Poirot said calmly. You signaled the repeat, he continued, and you trusted the orchestra to obey. Harcourt smiled thinly. You cannot prove I controlled the music. Poirot nodded. No, but I can prove you relied on it. Poirot gestured gently. A witness heard what others could not, he said, because she listens for mistakes. Harcourt's smile faltered. Poirot leaned closer. And your mistake was believing that perfection is silent. Edith Marrow was the final witness called. She stood straight, violin absent, but posture intact. Poirot asked one question. What told you this was not natural? She answered without hesitation. The rhythm, she said. Death does not follow tempo. The room went still. Later that night, Poirot returned alone to the ballroom. He imagined the orchestra again, the dancers, the signal from above. He imagined the breath, the pause, the note that should not have existed. A witness out of rhythm, Poirot murmured. He adjusted his moustache. And that, he added softly, is how truth finds its voice. Chapter 8. The Killer Who Trusted the Performance. The most dangerous killers were not those who acted in shadow. They were the ones who trusted the stage. At Bramblewick Ballroom, everything had been prepared like a flawless performance. Rehearsed cues, controlled lighting, disciplined movement. The killer had not feared witnesses. On the contrary, he had relied on them. 100 eyes watching the wrong thing were better than none at all. Hercule Poirot understood this now with absolute clarity. He stood once more at the edge of the ballroom floor, alone except for Inspector Finch, who waited quietly near the doors. The chandeliers glowed at half strength, as though the room itself was reluctant to return fully to life. The performance, Poirot said softly, was the alibi. Finch frowned. You mean the dance? Poirot nodded. The dance, the music, the etiquette, all of it. When everyone is part of the performance, no one believes they are witnessing a crime. Poirot asked Finch for something unusual again. Tonight, Poirot said, I wish to repeat the final waltz. Finch stared at him. You're joking. Poirot shook his head. No, I am reconstructing belief. Within the hour, the ballroom was arranged exactly as it had been on the night of the murder. The orchestra returned, subdued, but professional. A small group of officers and staff stood in for dancers, carefully positioned. Poirot himself took the place of Edmund Caldwell. Play, Poirot instructed gently. The music began. The familiar rhythm filled the room, warm and reassuring. Poirot raised his hand, mimicking Caldwell's posture, counting silently. 1, 2, 3. He turned, and on the repeated passage, he felt it, not poison, but expectation. Poirot stopped the music with a raised hand. Thank you, he said. The silence afterward felt heavier than sound. Poirot turned to Finch. Inspector, he said, tell me, what would you do if you believed something terrible was about to happen, but everyone around you expected the performance to continue? Finch hesitated. I suppose I'd hesitate. Poirot nodded. Exactly. Poirot gestured around the room. This crime did not rely on speed, he continued. It relied on obedience. Poirot summoned Lionel Harcourt again, this time not to an interrogation room, but to the ballroom itself. Harcourt entered with visible irritation, masked by his usual composure. You enjoy theatrics, Monsieur Poirot, he said dryly. Poirot smiled. Only when the theatre reveals truth. Poirot gestured to the orchestra. Music, if you please. The waltz began again. Poirot walked slowly around Harcourt as the music played. You trusted this, Poirot said calmly. The structure, the predictability, the fact that everyone would do exactly what they were trained to do, Harcourt scoffed. You're describing civilization. Poirot nodded. Yes, and civilization can be weaponized. Poirot stopped directly in front of him. You signaled the repeat, Poirot said. You placed your people, he continued. You relied on the dancers to keep dancing, he finished. Harcourt's smile tightened. Still no proof I touched the poison. Poirot replied softly. You did not need to. Poirot addressed the room now, his voice steady. Murder does not always require force, he said. Sometimes it requires only that everyone behave as expected. Poirot turned. toward Mrs. Brookhurst, standing pale near the wall. "You expected the steward to assist," Poirot said gently. "She did. Exactly once." Poirot turned to Miss Harper. "You expected the partner to hold on," he said. "She did, until she was released." Poirot turned back to Harcourt. "And you expected the orchestra to keep playing," Poirot said quietly. The conductor lowered his gaze. Harcourt's jaw clenched. Poirot's voice softened but sharpened in meaning. "You trusted the performance to finish the crime for you?" Harcourt laughed suddenly, brittle and sharp. "You make it sound poetic." Poirot nodded. "Poetry is often how brutality disguises itself." Poirot stepped closer. "You did not kill Caldwell with poison alone," Poirot said. "You killed him by ensuring no one would interrupt the moment when he needed help." Harcourt's eyes flashed. "He chose not to be helped." Poirot shook his head. "No, he was taught not to disturb the performance." Silence followed. Inspector Finch stepped forward. "Mr. Harcourt," Finch said firmly, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." Harcourt exhaled slowly, as though the fight had finally left him. As officers led him away, Poirot turned to the orchestra. "You may stop now," Poirot said gently. The music faded. The ballroom fell silent. Later that evening, Poirot stood alone beneath the chandeliers. He looked at the empty floor where dancers had once turned so perfectly. "The killer trusted the performance," Poirot murmured. He adjusted his moustache. "But performance," he added softly, "always ends." And when it did, there was nowhere left for the truth to hide. Chapter 9, When the Music Finally Stops. When the music finally stopped, the silence was not empty. It was crowded with memory. The Bramblewick Ballroom had never known such quiet. No tuning violins, no murmured anticipation, no polite applause rehearsed by habit. The chandeliers glowed softly, illuminating a room that now understood what it had helped conceal. Hercule Poirot stood very still at the center of the floor. This was the moment he trusted most. Not accusation, not arrest, but after. The moment when performance ended and truth, stripped of rhythm and distraction, had nowhere left to hide. Inspector Finch approached slowly. "It's done," Finch said. "Harcourt has been charged. Brookhurst and Merritt will testify. The orchestra too." Poirot nodded, though his gaze never left the floorboards. "Yes," he said softly. "Now comes understanding." The remaining guests were gathered one final time. Not suspects now, participants. They stood along the edges of the ballroom, faces uneasy, hands clasped, eyes avoiding the center where Edmund Caldwell had fallen. Poirot addressed them without reproach, but without comfort. "You did not kill a man," Poirot said calmly, "but you allowed a system to do it." Murmurs rippled through the group. Poirot raised a hand gently. "Please," he said, "listen." The room obeyed. "You trusted etiquette," Poirot continued. "You trusted music. You trusted that elegance meant safety." Poirot walked slowly as he spoke. But when danger arrived, it wore the costume of normality. He stopped beneath the largest chandelier, and so no one interrupted. Poirot turned to Miss Harper. "You loved him," Poirot said gently. She nodded, eyes wet. "And because you loved him," Poirot continued, "you respected his desire not to cause a scene." She whispered, "He was always like that." Poirot nodded, and the killer knew it. Poirot turned to the stewards. "You were trained to correct mistakes," he said calmly, "but only within the choreography. You were given." Mrs. Brookhurst lowered her head. Poirot turned to the orchestra. "You were trained never to stop," he said softly, "even when something felt wrong." The conductor swallowed. Poirot folded his hands. "Each of you followed your role," Poirot said, "and together those roles became a weapon." Inspector Finch cleared his throat. "You're saying the room itself was complicit?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes, that is why this murder is so unsettling." Poirot looked around once more. "Murderers often hide behind darkness," he said, "but this one hid behind tradition." Later, Poirot walked the floor with Finch, alone again. "The law will handle Harcourt," Finch said. "But the rest? They'll walk away." Poirot nodded. "Yes, and they will remember." Finch frowned. "You think that's enough?" Poirot stopped walking. "Inspector," he said, "gently, guilt that is examined becomes conscience." Poirot tapped his temple lightly. "And conscience," he added, "is the only prison that travels with us." The ballroom was closed for the night. As Poirot prepared to leave, he paused near the orchestra platform. One violin lay forgotten on a chair. He picked it up carefully, turning it in his hands. "Music," Poirot murmured, "is innocent." He placed the violin back gently. "But those who use it," he added softly, "are not always so." Outside, the evening air felt lighter. Poirot stood on the steps of Bramblewick Hall and looked back once more at the tall windows glowing faintly. "When the music finally stops," Poirot said quietly, "we hear ourselves think." Inspector Finch nodded. "And sometimes we don't like what we hear." Poirot smiled faintly. "That," he replied, "is how justice begins." Chapter 10. Justice beneath the chandeliers. Justice did not always announce itself. It did not arrive with raised voices or triumphant gestures. More often, it entered quietly, like the soft glow of a chandelier, long after the last dancer had left the floor. At Bramblewick Ballroom, justice came at dawn. The great hall stood empty, its mirrors catching pale morning light. Without music, without movement, the room felt older, wiser. The polished floor bore the faint ghosts of footsteps that had once moved in perfect harmony, unaware that elegance itself had been turned against them. Hercule Poirot stood beneath the central chandelier, hands clasped behind his back. "This," he murmured softly, "is where it ends." Inspector Harold Finch joined him moments later, a thin folder tucked beneath his arm. "Harcourt's statement is complete," Finch said. "He's admitted to arranging the repeat, influencing staff placement, and coordinating the delivery. He still insists he never intended for Caldwell to die in public." Poirot smiled faintly. "Of course he does." Finch frowned. "You sound unsurprised." Poirot inclined his head. "Because men like Harcourt never believe they intend consequences. They believe they intend control." Finch opened the folder. "Mrs. Brookhurst confirmed the glass was prepared in advance. Merritt admits to passing the handkerchief. The orchestra confirmed the signal." Poirot nodded slowly. "Then the choreography is complete." The final gathering took place later that morning. Not an interrogation, not a trial, a reckoning. The remaining witnesses, partners, stewards, musicians, stood along the perimeter of the ballroom, forming a quiet ring around the space where Edmund Caldwell had taken his final step. They were not accused, yet none felt innocent. Poirot addressed them gently. "You will each leave this room today," he said. "Without charges, without headlines, without punishment." A ripple of relief passed through the group, quickly followed by discomfort. Poirot continued, "But you will not leave unchanged." He walked slowly as he spoke, his footsteps echoing softly. "You followed the music. You followed the steps. You followed what was expected." Poirot stopped at the exact center of the floor. "And because you followed," he said, "a man died." No one spoke. Poirot turned to Miss Lillian Harper. "You loved Edmund Caldwell," Poirot said softly. She nodded, tears shining. "You honored his wish not to disrupt the dance," Poirot continued, "and in doing so you honored the killer's plan." She covered her mouth, trembling. Poirot's voice remained kind. "Love often obeys before it questions." He turned next to Mrs. Eleanor Brookhurst. "You were trained to assist," Poirot said, "but only within boundaries set by others." She whispered, "I didn't think." Poirot nodded. "That is the danger of choreography. It thinks for us." He turned to the orchestra. "You played on," Poirot said, "because stopping felt wrong." The conductor swallowed. "We follow the baton." Poirot replied softly, "Yes, and sometimes the baton points towards silence." Inspector Finch stepped forward. "Mr. Harcourt will stand trial," Finch said firmly. The law will address intent, coordination, and consequence. Poirot nodded. And the law must. Poirot turned back to the room. But justice, he said, is not only legal. He gestured upward to the chandeliers. These lights have seen countless dances, Poirot continued. They have witnessed joy, flirtation, celebration. Poirot's gaze hardened slightly. Last night they witnessed obedience. As the group dispersed, Poirot remained behind. He walked once more through the patterns of the waltz, counting softly. 1, 2, 3. He stopped beneath the chandelier where Caldwell had collapsed. You trusted beauty, Poirot murmured. You trusted order, he added. And you trusted that no one would break the spell. Poirot looked up at the crystal arms above him. But beauty, he said quietly, demands vigilance. Inspector Finch returned as Poirot prepared to leave. You've changed this place, Finch said. Poirot smiled faintly. No, I have only removed its illusion. Finch hesitated. Do you think they'll remember? Poirot paused at the doorway. Inspector, he said gently, people forget facts. Poirot touched his temple, but they remember discomfort. Outside, the morning air was crisp. Poirot stood on the steps of Bramblewick Hall and looked back at the tall windows, now reflecting the pale sky instead of candlelight. The chandeliers will shine again, Poirot said softly. The orchestra will return. The dancers will trust the floor. Poirot adjusted his moustache. But somewhere, he added, a hesitation will remain. He turned away. Justice, Poirot concluded quietly, is not about ending a story. He stepped down into the light. It is about ensuring it cannot be danced again.